thank you all. As Yasser mentioned, this is a work joined with Sonja Franzen and Carlos Vargas Silva here at Oxford, Sonja's at Maastricht. And this is part of a larger project in which we're working on, which is called the Labor Market Impacts of Forced Migration, which was funded by ISA and DFID. And it basically has two components. We're looking at the impact of refugees on host economies. And then we're also looking at the economic consequences of refugee return. And this is what this paper that I'm going to present today is all about. And you probably didn't notice, but the title changed a bit. So it's on return migration and economic outcomes in the conflict context. So the way I'm going to do the presentation today is sort of have a way of introduction. I'm going to present sort of the differences between of the conceptualization of migration from an economic perspective and how should we think about this in terms of refugee migration, sort of point at the conceptual differences. Then I'll discuss the case study, data, and results. So basically, when we're looking at the economics of migration, we often find that international migration is temporary, and also that migrants take advantage of a higher return in the home country to skills that they have acquired abroad. So this has been substantiated in the literature. They acquire, for example, new knowledge of a language, different markets, and production techniques. There's plenty of evidence that the migration experience often results in a wage premium. And here I cited one of the latest ones by Wawa in 2015, but there's plenty of evidence showing that there's a wage premium for those that return. And also there's evidence that migrants accumulate resources for later investment back in their home country, and that the returnees are likely to become entrepreneurs. But this previous literature has mostly focused on voluntary or economic migration. And as was mentioned this morning, there's millions of people around the world that are forced migrants. I think, I'm not going to repeat this because it was discussed this morning, but I think an important point to make is that a lot of these refugee migrants end up going to developing countries. About 80% are hosted in neighboring developing countries. And what's most important is that a lot of these refugee migrants become returnees, right? They eventually return home, and the consequences of being a returnee are also likely to be very different in the post-conflict context. So in this study, what we do is we explore the implications of being a returnee in a situation in which conflict was the original driver of a large-scale migration, followed by a massive return migration at the end of the conflict. We're going to look at the 1993, at the civil conflict between 1993 and 2000 in Burundi, and we use countrywide panel data collected in 2011 and 2015. So one of the main conceptual differences that we wanted to make here, and which is a big part of the paper, is that when we look at refugee migrations, migrants have different motivations to migrate, and security is a key driver. So we talked this morning, there was a talk about whether wasn't economic motives as well. Well, what we try to show in this paper, and we formally do it with a model, is that in the refugee context, migration may take place even if there's the expected earning gap between host and home country is small or even negative. So there might be an economic motivation to migrate, but even if there's a negative gap, people would still migrate if the security gap is large enough. There's also limited transportation options. People often have to walk. They often have to leave behind stock, land, and other assets that are difficult to reclaim when you go back. And when we think about return, also decreasing the level of violence is likely to be a key determinant of the timing of returns, right? But most importantly, return is also often involuntary. And this is very different from the case of economic migrants, in which they're able to decide the timing of return to take advantage of the difference in returns to skills between the two countries. So in the paper, and I'm not going to go over the model, we formally showed that in a conflict setting, migration and return may take place even if it's not beneficial in economic terms. It just takes a large security gap. And if migration takes place, the skill sets of the migrant are transformed by the migration experience, right? We talked earlier about the possibility of being there being positive aspects, like learning a new language or production techniques, but there could also be a loss or deterioration or downgrading of skills. So what we do is we look at the case of Burundi, just to give you a little bit of the background. They had their first democratic elections in 1993. The winner was the first Hutu president of the country and was assassinated a few months after the election. So there was a long civil war between 1993 and 2000 with an estimated 300,000 people killed. And there were hundreds of thousands of people leaving the country. And the main destination was Tanzania. Just to show you the relevance of Tanzania as a hosting country, we see here that Burundi is a landlocked, very small country, and it fares really badly in all the economic variables you can think of, but it borders with the DRC, with Rwanda, and with Tanzania. At the time, Rwanda was going another conflict, and things were not that better in the DRC, so Tanzania became sort of the place to go. This is a map of Burundi, and what we have in here is the number of people that had been refugees in Tanzania. And what's on parentheses below the first one, below the brackets, is the percentage of the population that had been refugees in Tanzania. So it's not surprising that along the border with Tanzania, we see a darker shade, because they were more likely to move to Tanzania during the conflict. Also, to give you a little bit of background of the initial conditions in Tanzania, most of the refugees were placed in camps in this northwestern part of the country. They were not given agricultural land for agricultural activities, although many engaged in agricultural employment in neighboring villages shortly after arrival. There's evidence that the casual wage for natives dropped about 50% because they were being probably replaced by the refugees, and there was some evidence of some initial trade. However, over time, the Tanzanian government started placing a lot of restrictions. They, for example, restricted the movement of refugees to 4 kilometers from the camps and imposed limitations on the type of economic activities that they could engage on. For example, they were not able to work outside the camps or own land or own farms in the camp areas. Many became dependent on international aid support, and Tanzania eventually started putting pressure to close refugee camps and require a lot of these refugees to return home. So what we have in here is, for example, from 2000, which is sort of the official end of the conflict, the Arusha Peace and Reconciliation Agreement, you start seeing a big return of Burundians back to Tanzania, of Burundians back to Burundi. Sorry. So for our paper, this is a map of Burundi. The data collection was in 2011, 2015. Each red dot is where we collected information. About 15 households were interviewed in each of those red dots. So there were about between 45 and 130 households interviewed per province. Overall, we had about 1,500 households being interviewed in each wave. We had individual, household, and community questionnaires. We had a separate questionnaire for a randomly selected returnee per household. And we had 2 cross-sections in Bujumbura, which is the capital. So we have a household panel. We are able to trace these people from 2011 to 2015. And the re-interview rate was pretty good. It was about 90%. So these are some pictures of the fieldwork, which I'm going to skip really quickly, so for the sake of time. But at the end, what we do after cleaning the data is we exclude the households from Bujumbura, which is the capital. There's lots of reasons that I can discuss later about why we did that. But we're left with about 904 households living in 87 communities, for which we have complete data in 2011 and 2015. So we can follow them over time. So our methodological approach is as follows. Our variable of interest is livestock of the household. Basically, when you look at the literature on the economics of Burundi and these neighboring countries, Livestock is the main form of capital accumulation. It acts as savings and insurance mechanisms. So it's a good measure of economic outcome. We control for key household and community factors. And because of possible endogeneity issues, we use IB estimations and propensity score matching. We explore possible channels that can explain our results. So we look at economic activities, vulnerability to crime, health difference, time since return, and time abroad. So our estimation technique, really quickly, what we're interested in is this beta coefficient, which is what's telling us the household or the individual is a returnee. The way we measure whether a household has a returnee is by looking at different things. So at the individual level is for somebody that's been across the border for at least 3 months or more. And at the household level, we look at the share of household members who are returnees. We look at whether one member of the household is a returnee. We also look at variations as, for example, if the household level was the household head was a returnee. So just some descriptive statistics, what we see in here is livestock units comparing returnees and stayees. We have to standardize them, and the typical way of doing this is to using tropical livestock units. And what we find is basically that there's a gap between returnees and stayees. For example, if you look at 2015, there's about 0.08 difference between returnees and stayees, meaning that returnees were half a goat less rich than stayees per household, per adult per household. We use different control variables in our estimations, so the typical control demographics. We also use whether, we control for whether the household had an IDP member or whether the individual was an internally displaced person, and deaths of conflicts in the community. So again, for possible endogeneity issues, we use an instrumental variable. So what we argue is that there's more likely to be self-selection in terms of those who migrate than returning, because returning was mostly involuntary. They were made to go back. However, living in the first place, there could be some selection in terms of moving across borders. So we explore different things, but we basically need to find an exogenous factor that affects the likelihood of being an international migrant, and what we ended up using was proximity to Tanzania. Basically the ease of traveling to Tanzania, because a substantial portion of the displacement also occurred by foot, so we use the logarithm of the inverse of distance to the border at birth as an instrument for the likelihood of being a returnee. Is this a good instrument? We try to correlate this with different things that could be correlated to household level characteristics to make sure that this was a good instrument. So we didn't find correlation of proximity with pre-war livestock, pre-war years of education, different type of activities, and whether the individual or the household had IDPs. However, when we look at whether at proximity as an explanatory for being an international member, an international migrant, we see that that it's a very good variable explaining the likelihood of migrating. So just to go into the results, I have 5 minutes, so hopefully I'll make sense of this well. We look at the impacts on livestock, and what we find is very similar to what we find in the descriptive statistics, as I showed earlier. Basically, refugee households are less they have a lower livestock compared to stayees. So there's about a 0.16 TLU difference between stayees and refugees. Basically, that's, if you remember the TLU units that I showed you earlier, basically that's per household, as household per adult, they have one goat less, if that makes it easier to understand. So we want to understand why is this the case? What could be the channels that are explaining, or what are the factors that may be behind our findings? So we look at different things. We look at labor markets, we look at the vulnerability of crime, and we look at time abroad and time since return. So in here, what I show you is the activities during and just before migration. If you remember, we also had an in-depth interview with returnees. So what you see in here is that about 1/3 of the returnees were inactive during migration, compared to just 10% before migration. You also see that there's a big change in farming. About 70% used to do farming before migration, and then it goes down to about 1/3. And then there was also pre-migration, there were less likely to be employees, but then during migration, they were more likely to be employees. So in here, we look at the impact of being a returnee on main economic activities. And what we find is that they're less likely to be in self-employment, and they're more likely to be in farming. And this is on current activities. And this contrasts widely with what we're used to in the economics of migration, in which a lot of times return migrants tend to go into self-employment. So in this case, refugee migrants are less likely to be in self-employment. We also look at all the economic activities. So in the one before, we were looking exclusively at the main economic activity. So when we look at all the economic activities, we find that they're more likely to be agricultural employees, and they're more likely to be in farming too. So to understand a bit more on this, what we also did was to look at the livestock level in household by economic activities, but only for stayees, okay? And this is what we find. We find that self-employment tends to pay more than the other activities, right? Or even non-agricultural employees. But agricultural employees have the lower livestock units. So what we're showing here is stayees, just to give you an idea that it can explain why is that refugees have lower units of livestock. They tend to be in the activities that pay worst. We also look at crime and health shocks. Basically, we didn't really find much other than they were less likely to have theft of cash, but they probably are less likely to hold cash anyways. And with health, we didn't find much other than also they're less likely to report incidents of worse health. We look at time abroad and time since return. And this is, in our sample, the pattern of return. And what we find in here is that the results are mostly driven by recent returnees. So recent returnees are the ones that are more likely to have lower livestock levels. We also conducted robustness, and I'm almost done. We did propensity score matching. Basically, we used this sort of as a treatment effect, in which treatment was to be a returnee household. We matched the household based on pre-war characteristics that should not be affected by the treatment. And results were pretty similar to what we had before. So all in all, our results indicated that returnee households have significantly lower levels of livestock. In the search of explanations, we found that returnees are more likely to engage in activities that tend to be less profitable. So there's a key role of legal and practical restrictions on economic activities while in displacement, which could have resulted in higher levels of inactivity and potential deterioration of skills. So this highlights, in a way, the importance of allowing refugees the opportunity to engage in employment and other economic activities while in displacement. We also, like a big part of our paper is just to make the point that that in the conflict context, migration and return can still take place, even when it's not economically beneficial to do so. Now I finalize my presentation just to making some caveats. Basically, our results might not be applicable to other circumstances. these were refugees who were mostly in situation of encampment. There were legal restrictions also on economic activities and movement. They were required to return home by the host country, and they were returning to one of the poorest countries in the world. I didn't show you some of the statistics, but Burundi basically ranks either the last or the second last in almost all economic variables out there. So the consequences of return could be different in situations in which refugees are integrated in the host economy and have the option of staying permanently. So our results can be very specific to this specific case. Thank you.